The most dangerous moment in human history did not begin with shouting. It did not begin with threats or demands or the cold machinery of war grinding into motion. It began instead with silence. A terrible, stretching silence that lasted for 6 full days while the most powerful leaders on Earth decided what to say to each other, and whether saying the wrong thing might end everything. We imagine the Cuban Missile Crisis as a time of urgent action, of stern-faced men making rapid decisions in smoke-filled rooms. But the truth is far stranger. When American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba on the 14th of October 1962, Nikita Khrushchev had no idea his secret had been found. And when he finally learned the truth, what he said was not what the history books have led us to believe. The standard story tells us that Khrushchev was a brash gambler, a reckless leader who pushed the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation through arrogance and aggression. It tells us he blustered and threatened, and only backed down when faced with American strength. But the documents declassified decades later reveal something different. They reveal a man who could not sleep. A man who wrote letters in the middle of the night that rambled with fear and desperate hope. A man who, at the height of the crisis, dictated words to his stenographer with tears in his eyes. What Khrushchev really said when the missiles were discovered tells us not the story of a villain, but the story of a man suddenly aware that his decisions might kill every child on Earth. The morning of the 16th of October 1962 broke cool and clear over Washington. The leaves had just begun to turn along the Potomac, their edges touched with gold and rust. President John F. Kennedy sat in his bedroom at the White House, eating breakfast from a tray and reading the morning newspapers. He did not yet know that his national security advisor was rushing toward him with photographs that would change history. He did not know that in the next few hours, he would learn that nuclear missiles capable of reaching Washington in 13 minutes were being assembled 90 miles from Florida. He finished his soft-boiled eggs. He sipped his coffee. He had no way of knowing these were the last peaceful moments he would experience for nearly 2 weeks. McGeorge Bundy entered with a folder of photographs. Kennedy looked at the grainy black and white images, at the long cylindrical shapes and the construction equipment surrounding them. The photographs smelled faintly of developing chemicals, still fresh from the CIA's Photo Interpretation Center. Kennedy's hand tightened on the edge of the folder. His face, witnesses would later recall, went very still. He did not curse or shout. He asked a single question, his voice quiet and controlled. How long before they're ready to fire? The answer was somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, perhaps less. Kennedy set down his coffee cup and said nothing for a long moment. Then he began making phone calls. But across the ocean, in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev knew nothing of this. He went about his day believing his great gamble remained hidden. He attended meetings. He signed documents. He ate his lunch of borscht and black bread in his office at the Kremlin, the soup steaming in a bowl of blue and white ceramic. The October light came through tall windows, falling across papers stacked on his desk. He was 68 years old, a squat and energetic man with a bald head and small, quick eyes. He had survived Stalin's purges. He had seen millions die in war and famine. He believed he understood how the world worked, how power moved between nations like water finding its level. He believed the Americans would accept his missiles the way he had accepted theirs in Turkey. He was wrong. For 6 days, Kennedy and his advisors debated in secret while Khrushchev remained ignorant. They met in the cabinet room, in offices, in hallways. They argued about airstrikes and invasions and blockades. They calculated casualties in the millions. They smoked endless cigarettes until the air turned blue and thick. And all that time, Khrushchev continued with his schedule as if nothing had changed. He gave speeches about peaceful coexistence. He met with visiting diplomats. He dictated cheerful letters to allies. The dramatic irony was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had wagered everything on a secret, speaking confidently about the future. While half a world away, men were deciding whether to bomb his missiles before they could be armed. The moment of revelation came on October 22, when Kennedy addressed the American people on television. Khrushchev learned what was happening not through diplomatic channels, but from a translation of Kennedy's speech delivered to him by anxious aides. He sat in his office at the Kremlin as the words were read to him. The missiles had been discovered. The Americans were implementing a naval blockade. Kennedy had called it a quarantine to avoid the word blockade, which under international law could be considered an act of war. But everyone understood what it meant. Khrushchev listened to the translation. His face, according to those present, became very red. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. What he said in that moment has been reported differently by different witnesses. Some claim he erupted in fury, cursing Kennedy and the Americans. Others say he sat in stunned silence, unable to speak for several minutes. The truth, as best as we can reconstruct it, lies somewhere between. He spoke quietly at first, almost to himself. "He's gone and done it," Khrushchev said. "The young man has gone and done it." There was something like admiration in his voice, mixed with fear. He had expected Kennedy to accept the missiles as a fait accompli, the way leaders so often accept what they cannot easily change. He had not expected this. It was not the discovery that broke Khrushchev's confidence. It was the calculation that followed. He sat with his military advisors through that night, the hours stretching past midnight and into the gray Moscow dawn. The Kremlin halls were quiet, their footsteps echoing on marble floors polished by centuries of history. They reviewed the positions of Soviet ships heading toward Cuba. They discussed the readiness of the missiles already on the island. They talked about what would happen if American planes attacked. And somewhere in those long hours, Khrushchev began to understand what he had done. He had placed nuclear weapons in the hands of commanders who might use them. He had created a situation where accidents could end civilization. He had gambled, and now the stakes had become clear. The letters Khrushchev wrote over the next several days reveal a mind in torment. They were not the words of a confident leader playing chess with his adversary. They were the words of a man who could not stop thinking about his grandchildren. On October 24, as Soviet ships approached the American blockade line, Khrushchev dictated a letter to Kennedy that would not be sent until days later. "If you have not lost your self-control and sensibly conceive what this might lead to," he wrote, "then, Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war." The image was vivid and strange, a knot of war. Two men pulling on a rope, each trying to prove their strength, while the knot tightened and tightened between them. In Washington, Kennedy received this letter and read it alone in his office. The words struck him differently than the formal diplomatic communications he was used to receiving. There was something personal in them, something almost desperate. Kennedy set down the letter and looked out the window at the rose garden, where the last flowers of autumn still held their colors. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that Khrushchev was as frightened as he was. This was not simply a contest of wills between two superpowers. It was two human beings trying not to destroy the world. The ships approached the blockade line. American destroyers waited, their guns manned, their crews at battle stations. In the operations room beneath the Pentagon, military officials tracked the movement of every vessel on enormous maps. The tension was physical, a weight that pressed down on shoulders and made hands tremble. Men who had survived World War II found themselves more frightened than they had ever been in combat. At least in war, they knew what was happening. Here, they could only wait and wonder if the next hour would bring annihilation. And then the ships stopped. The Soviet vessels approaching Cuba slowed, turned, and began heading back toward the Soviet Union. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, turned to McGeorge Bundy with a phrase that would become famous. "We're eyeball to eyeball," he said, and I think the other fellow just blinked. But Rusk was wrong about what that blink meant. It was not weakness. It was wisdom. Khrushchev had ordered his ships to turn around not because he was afraid of American power, but because he was afraid of what would happen if those ships were stopped. He was afraid of the accident that would start the war no one wanted. Back in Moscow, Khrushchev paced his office through another sleepless night. The carpet beneath his feet was thick and red, worn by decades of leaders who had walked the same path while making decisions that shaped millions of lives. He stopped at the window and looked out at the October darkness. The Kremlin walls loomed around him, ancient and impenetrable, but he knew they would provide no protection from nuclear weapons. He thought about the children asleep in Moscow's apartments. He thought about the villages where he had grown up, the simple houses and the smell of bread baking in communal ovens. All of it could disappear in a flash of light. What Khrushchev really said in these private moments was recorded by his son Sergei, who was with him throughout the crisis. The words were nothing like the bombastic public declarations that had made Khrushchev famous. "They want to push us into war," he told his son quietly. "But I'm not going to let them." He spoke of Kennedy with something that sounded almost like respect. "He's young, but he's not stupid. He knows what would happen if we start shooting." Khrushchev paused and rubbed his tired eyes. "We cannot let this happen. We cannot be the ones who end everything." On October 26, Khrushchev dictated the most remarkable letter of the crisis. It was rambling and emotional, full of personal appeals and philosophical reflections. He wrote about the catastrophe of thermonuclear war and the knot that both nations had created. He wrote about his grandchildren and Kennedy's children. "We must not succumb to intoxication and petty passions," he wrote, "regardless of whether elections are impending in this or that country or not impending." The letter went on for pages, the words tumbling out as if Khrushchev could not stop himself. It read less like a diplomatic communication than like a confession. Kennedy received this letter late on Friday evening. His advisors gathered around him as he read it, the room silent except for the rustle of paper. The letter proposed a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the Americans promised not to invade the island. Kennedy looked up from the pages. "He sounds scared," someone said. Kennedy nodded slowly. "Maybe he should be. I know I am." But before Kennedy could respond, a second letter arrived on Saturday morning. This one was formal, legalistic, clearly written by committee. It demanded that the United States remove its missiles from Turkey as a condition for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. The contrast with the first letter was jarring. Kennedy and his advisors were confused. Which letter represented Khrushchev's true position? Had he changed his mind overnight? Had others in the Kremlin overruled him? The situation, which had seemed to be resolving, suddenly became more dangerous than ever. What had happened in Moscow was this. Khrushchev had dictated his emotional letter late on Friday night, exhausted and afraid. But in the morning, his more hawkish advisors had insisted on tougher terms. They had convinced him that conceding too easily would make the Soviet Union look weak. They had drafted the second letter over his objections. Khrushchev signed it reluctantly, already regretting his decision. He was caught between his own fear and the expectations of those around him. He was learning, as leaders so often do, that power is not the same as control. In Washington, Robert Kennedy proposed what would become known as the trollop ploy. They would simply ignore the second letter and respond only to the first. They would accept the terms Khrushchev had offered in his emotional midnight message. It was a gamble, but it was also a gesture of understanding. Kennedy was choosing to believe that the frightened man who wrote the first letter was the real Khrushchev. He was choosing to believe that his adversary wanted to find a way out. Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, that Saturday evening. They sat together in the Justice Department, the building quiet and dark around them. Robert's face was drawn with exhaustion. He had barely slept in days. "We have to have a commitment by tomorrow," he told Dobrynin. "If we don't get one, there will be military action against Cuba." He paused, then added something that was not part of his official instructions. "The president is under great pressure from the military to attack. He doesn't want to do it, but he may not have a choice." Dobrynin transmitted this message to Moscow, and it reached Khrushchev in the middle of the night. The Soviet leader read it in his office, alone except for his secretary. Outside the windows, Moscow slept uneasily. The weather had turned cold, and the first hints of winter touched the air. Khrushchev set down the message and closed his eyes. He had to decide now. He had to choose between his pride and his fear, between the expectations of his government and the screaming of his own conscience. What Khrushchev really said in that moment was recorded by his secretary. He spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "We have to save the world," he said. "We cannot let the hotheads on both sides push us into the abyss." He opened his eyes and began dictating a response. The missiles would be withdrawn. The Soviet Union would accept Kennedy's terms. It was over. The announcement came the next morning, October 28. Khrushchev's message was broadcast on Radio Moscow before it was even delivered through diplomatic channels. He wanted there to be no delay, no chance for the situation to spiral further. He wanted the world to know that the threat had passed. In Washington, Kennedy received the news and slumped back in his chair. His advisors were already celebrating, but he silenced them with a look. "We must not gloat," he said. "We must give Khrushchev his dignity. We must give him a way to claim victory." Kennedy understood something crucial in that moment. He understood that humiliating Khrushchev would make the next crisis more dangerous, not less. He understood that his adversary needed to save face with his own people, his own government, his own sense of himself. So Kennedy praised Khrushchev's statesmanship. He emphasized the peaceful resolution rather than the Soviet retreat. He gave his enemy a gift that cost him nothing but could prevent future wars. It was not the threat of force that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the recognition of shared humanity. In the weeks that followed, Khrushchev reflected on what had happened. He spoke with his son about the decisions he had made, the letters he had written, the fear that had gripped him through those 13 days. "I was scared," he admitted. "I was scared like I had never been scared before, not even during the war." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. Kennedy was scared too. I could feel it in his letters, and that is what saved us. We were both scared enough to stop. The crisis changed Khrushchev. He had stared into the abyss and seen what waited there. He began speaking more urgently about disarmament, about peaceful coexistence, about finding ways to resolve conflicts without war. He pushed for the limited nuclear test ban treaty, signed the following year. He sought to establish a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, the famous hotline that would allow leaders to speak directly in moments of crisis rather than waiting for diplomatic cables to crawl across the ocean. But the crisis also weakened him within his own government. His colleagues viewed his decision to withdraw the missiles as a humiliation, a sign of weakness in the face of American pressure. They began plotting against him, gathering grievances, waiting for the right moment. 2 years later, in October 1964, they forced him from power. He spent his final years in obscure retirement, tending his garden outside Moscow, dictating memoirs that revealed his private thoughts about the crisis that had defined his legacy. What Khrushchev really said when he looked back on those days was this: "We were on the edge of the volcano. One more step, and we would all have fallen in." He spoke without bitterness about the decision that ended his career. He said he would make the same choice again. He said that being remembered as the man who backed down was better than being remembered as the man who destroyed the world. "They call me a coward now," he told a visitor, "but my grandchildren are alive. All the grandchildren of the world are alive. That is worth more than pride." The missiles themselves were loaded onto ships and carried back to the Soviet Union. American observers watched from aircraft as the long cylindrical shapes were covered with tarps and lowered into cargo holds. The crisis was over, but its lessons would echo through the decades that followed. Both sides had seen how close they had come to catastrophe. Both sides began the slow, careful work of building structures to prevent it from happening again. Kennedy did not live to see much of that work completed. He was assassinated in Dallas 13 months after the crisis ended. But in the time he had left, he spoke often about what he had learned during those 13 days in October. He spoke about the importance of communication, of understanding your adversary's fears and constraints, of leaving room for compromise. He spoke about the terrifying simplicity of the weapons both sides possessed, how quickly a miscalculation could cascade into extinction. "We all inhabit this small planet," he said in a speech at American University. "We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. Khrushchev, in his retirement, kept a copy of that speech among his papers. He had read it when it was first delivered, and he had wept. He had recognized in Kennedy's words the same fears and hopes that had driven him through the crisis. They had been enemies, separated by ideology and history and the accumulated grievances of empires. But in those 13 days, they had become something else as well. They had become two men trying to keep the world alive. The letters they exchanged remain among the most remarkable documents of the 20th century. They show leadership not as certainty but as doubt. They show courage not as the absence of fear but as the willingness to act wisely despite it. They show two men, burdened with unimaginable responsibility, struggling to find the words that would prevent disaster. What Khrushchev really said when the missiles were discovered was not what his enemies expected. It was not bluster or threats or the cold calculations of power politics. It was something far more human and far more hopeful. He said he was afraid. He said he could not let the world end. He said that the children mattered more than pride. In the end, that was enough. In the end, the words that might have started a war instead became the words that prevented one. The missiles went back to the Soviet Union. The bombers returned to their bases. The submarines descended to their patrol depths and continued their silent journeys through the cold Black Sea. The world went on, but it went on changed. Those 13 days had shown everyone how fragile everything really was. They had shown that the weapons humanity had created were too powerful for the politics humanity had invented to handle them. They had shown that survival required not just strength but wisdom, not just determination but restraint. The crisis became a turning point, a moment when the world stepped back from the edge and asked itself whether it wanted to live or die. What Khrushchev really said mattered because it revealed the truth behind the propaganda. It showed that the Cold War was not simply a contest between good and evil, between freedom and tyranny, between two incompatible visions of human society. It was also a contest between fear and reason, between pride and survival, between the worst impulses of human nature and the best. And in that contest, at least for those 13 days, the best impulses won. The old man who tended his garden outside Moscow knew this. He would watch his grandchildren playing among the tomato plants and the sunflowers, and he would remember the nights he could not sleep, the letters he had dictated with tears in his eyes, the moment he decided to let go of his pride and save the world instead. He had made many mistakes in his long life. He had done things he regretted, things that caused suffering and death. But in October 1962, when everything hung in the balance, he had chosen correctly. He had chosen life. Kennedy, too, understood this in his final months. He had seen his adversary's humanity through the fog of ideology and mistrust. He had recognized that the man on the other side of the confrontation was not a monster but a human being, burdened with the same fears and hopes that burden all of us. And in that recognition lay the possibility of peace. Not perfect peace, not the resolution of all conflicts, but something more modest and more achievable. The peace of two men agreeing not to destroy each other. The peace of wisdom overcoming pride. What Khrushchev really said when the missiles were discovered was, in the end, what we all might say if we found ourselves at the edge of the abyss. He said he was terrified. He said he wanted to live. He said he wanted his grandchildren to grow up in a world that still existed. He said the knot of war had to be loosened, that the rope had to go slack, that someone had to stop pulling before everything was torn apart. And somewhere in those words, in that fear, in that desperate hope, the future of humanity was preserved. The crisis has been studied and analyzed for more than 60 years now. Historians have examined every decision, every message, every moment of those 13 days. They have argued about who was right and who was wrong, who won and who lost, what could have been done differently. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest one. When the moment of greatest danger arrived, the men with the power to destroy the world chose not to. They chose to step back. They chose to speak to each other as human beings rather than as enemies. They chose to let their fear make them wise rather than reckless. That choice is still available to us. It is always available to us. In every moment of crisis, in every conflict that seems impossible to resolve, there is still the possibility of stepping back from the edge. There is still the possibility of recognizing the humanity in our adversaries, of finding words that build bridges rather than walls, of letting wisdom triumph over pride. What Khrushchev really said reminds us that even the most powerful people are still human, still afraid, still capable of choosing the better path. The missiles are gone now, those particular missiles at least. The men who made those decisions have passed into history, but their words remain, preserved in archives and memoirs and the memories of those who witnessed those terrifying days. Their words remind us that history is not inevitable, that catastrophe is not predetermined, that the future depends on the choices we make in our moments of greatest fear. And there are countless more stories like this one, hidden in the archives of history, waiting to be remembered.